Welcome back. If you're just joining us, it's Daybreak on Trust Television, and this morning we'll be taking a deep dive into the issues of coup d'etat in Africa. Out of the 486 attempted or successive military coups carried out globally since 1950, Africa accounts for the largest number with 214, of which at least 106 have been successful. Based on the data compiled by American researchers Jonathan Powell and Clayton Thyne, at least 45 of the 54 nations across the African continent have experienced a single coup attempt since 1950. Therefore, the hail of the gunfire, which woke the residents of Libreville, the Gabonese capital, on Wednesday, signified the latest military coup in Africa and the 10th on the continent since 2017. The reverberation from the gunfire jolted not only Gabon, but Africa and the world. Guards in Niger ousted democratically elected government of President Mohamed Bazoum. The development in Gabon is raising red flags and concerns across the globe about the future of democracy in Africa. The resurgence of military intervention in Africa tops the burner of our discussion this morning in our studio on Daybreak. And to do justice to this discussion is Ambassador Haruna Ali Warkani. I hope I got that pronunciation correct. Ambassador Warkani is a retired diplomat with the ECOWAS Commission, Abuja, and the Deputy Country Chair of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. He is a strategist, a security administration expert, a cybersecurity practitioner, a diplomatic and international affairs analyst. It's a pleasure to have you join us in the studio once again, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good to see you again.
It's barely 1 month ago we brought you in here to look at the situation in Niger. Precisely a fortnight ago, if you like. And whilst the world is yet to completely digest whatever it was served in Niger, we wake up 2 days ago, or rather yesterday morning, to another takeover, this time around in the Central African nation of Gabon, a nation of barely 2 million people, surviving on the export of oil and other minerals, another French, if you like, protege. And as we saw in the case of Niger, celebrations adorned the streets of the country, whilst the president in a televised video was saying people should make noise about what is happening. The people instead of Gabon took to the streets to celebrate what appears to be people who have been fatigued by the long years of the Bongo's family rule. 52 years, we understand, since 1967. What exactly is happening in Africa? The Nigerian presidents have talked about being worried about what is appearing like a spread of autocratic government. But the concern that the international community is raising, including Nigeria's president, doesn't seem to reflect the concern of the people on ground, who, in one form, are not exactly in support of a military rule, but in another form, celebrates the fact that there is a break from what appears to be a seizure in the public space. Try to help us understand exactly what's happening.
Thank you. And viewers, it's a pleasure being here again. Like you rightly said, we were here some weeks ago talking about coups in Africa. And we did say clear that that was not the end of it. Mm-hmm. Indeed, there would be more of it. And true to the projections, here we are back again addressing another one. And it might also not be the last. Mm. Now, we did say, and we want to recall, the only antidote to these happenings or military coups or takeovers will be the institutionalization of good governance. And good governance starts with good elections. Democracy presumes that for someone to be declared a president or leader in any form, title, name, or whatsoever, you must have had the endorsement of a majority of the people whom you intend to govern. And having gotten there through the platform of good elections, there should also be good governance. However, in Africa, these are missing. Neither the elections as a vehicle to government, nor good governance as a practice. These are conspicuously missing in the political mix of what we call democracy. Democracy in itself does not necessarily mean the panacea to all problems. It is the practice. Democracy is a concept developed and practiced. Now, if the practice fails, surely democracy itself disappears. And that is what we are witnessing in Africa today. You go around the countries and you find that, yes, African states are dysfunctional. Bad governance has become the prerogative of politicians. And for them, anything goes. The greatest prize is accession to power. However it comes, that doesn't matter anymore. And so with this, we will surely be witnessing much more of this happening over and over again.
Right. And speaking about the current wave right now, from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Gabon, and all the other countries that don't necessarily have a constitutional democratic government put in place, because the description by the president, by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's spokesperson, is that of a contagion. And we all know what a contagion is, like a virus that spreads. So clearly, we're not there yet in terms of addressing where next is going to be, but we all have this feeling that the powers that be within the military across the continent are observing all of these issues and taking stock of what is happening, and perhaps even trying to assess what's going on in their country. I mean, Murik just yesterday had to come out and put a statement to discourage the Nigerian military and say, listen, don't think about this. we all know that we're going through a difficult period. But, you know, in fact, the defense headquarters just some weeks ago had to come out and say, listen, we're happy with the civilian rule and we're not contemplating any military takeover. What is happening? What triggered this awareness from the military? Because it has been decades since they last had this wave. I mean, in the 60s and in the 70s, they were having several, military interregnums across different parts of the continent. Yeah. But over the course of the 90s and the 2000s, it has somehow, remained, abated for quite some time. What, in your view, is triggering this new wave?
Well, like we just said, the bad governance is surely at the root of all this. Let's take Gabon closely. Gabon as a country of barely 2-point-something million people, good landmass, an endowment of natural resources, exportable crude oil of about 600,000 barrels per day.
200,000, sir.
Right? And you have like the largest manganese deposit in the world, and many other assorted minerals which are being exploited. Now, this is a country happily sitting on the equator in Africa, one of the 4 countries that has this special benefit of sitting on the equator, which should have attracted some other reasons for very good development. Now, with low population and very good income, our expectation would be that the country by now should have been developed. However, I can tell you, this is a country that we can say is a 2-city country, minus Libreville, the capital, and Port-Gentil. Literally, the rest of Gabon is a rural area. So where has the money gone to? All these monies, where has it gone to? Now, if we are talking about stability, you have a country that has been ruled by one single family for close to 65 years. After independence, 7 years thereafter, change of government came, and since then, people born from 1967 have never heard of any name other than Bongo. It can be Omar, it can be Ali, but it is Bongo, nonetheless. Now, assuming stability were to have been a good factor, by now, the country should be really an epitome of development in Africa. Unfortunately, it is not. So the people cannot change their government. Yes, elections are held regularly. 7-year term, you go, you come, the same story. Nothing changes, really. So, without these changes that should have brought about development, it would practically be impossible to expect that citizens would be happy. Now, the anatomy of coups in Africa will tell you that in the past, coups would occur and there would be like counter coups, right? And sometimes failures. However, what we have seen from Guinea, Conakry, to Niger, in between Burkina, Mali, and what have you, today Gabon, it has been smooth sailing for all these coups.
There's been little pushback or no pushback.
Opposition, rather than what you see on the street.
I think it was in Guinea we had a counter coup.
Well, the counter coup was just like a
replacement.
Correct. So you will see a trend that after all said and done, the military are being accepted, not because they might be better than the civilians, but for now, they seem to be the only option for people to express their disgust with the civilian administrations. And so, whether we like it or not, what we expect Africa to do would be to sit down and go back to the propositions of NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development. And some of the key indicators there had been the peer review mechanism. Can we review ourselves? That's the question, as leaders.
Talking about review, it does appear that the leaders are reviewing, but they're reviewing in a manner that is not consonant with best practice, because just yesterday, after this was announced, in a panic, in what appears to be a panic reaction, Rwanda moved to retire several military generals, including the special advisor to the President of Security, Cameroon, which is another place, another country whose name has been wagging in the talk of a lot of people, also moved swiftly to retire so many military generals and reshuffle the military cabinet. Is that what you think should be the reaction to what had happened in Gabon? And in the case of Gabon, just to add this to the question, there was a failed coup in 2019. Should that not have signaled what the moods were at the time when the president was just recovering from his stroke? What would you say are the signals to most of the countries where we think, without at the risk of saying we are encouraging it to happen in a place, what do you think are the apparent signs by these democratic governments that you are likely to be the next? There is no rhetorics around these things other than doing what is right.
Well, there's always a chasm between the governed and the governors. In this case, African politicians have become accustomed to getting to the top, remain there at the top, and hardly see what goes on. Therefore, we can easily say there is a governance disconnect. They don't even know what is really happening at the social level. So, as long as perks of offices are provided for, you seem not to bother whether people are living and what is this quality of life they are having per day, per month, per year in, year out, educational facilities, healthcare, infrastructure, social development generally. So you see the indices have been going down.
Yeah, but pardon the interruption. I can understand that if you're talking about Paul Biya, for instance, in Cameroon, or any other sit-tight leader, including Ali Bongo, for instance, where the economics, the indices are not looking good. But Rwanda under Paul Kagame has been a blossoming country, a shining light for many African countries. I mean,
Yes.
politically speaking also, he's taking the country to new heights.
Yes.
Surely he shouldn't have anything to worry about, but it does appear that he's also looking over his shoulder. So is it also possible that there is also this discontent around, you know, having just one leader for decades without any sort of change?
Definitely. Paul Kagame has become like a shining example in Africa. Took the country out of chaos, converted it into development. Agreed. But what ordinarily should also happen is the mentoring of successive leaders that might come with the same concept of development to continue, not for him or anyone else in that regard, to continue, because after all, after some time, it converts into a dynasty. If care is not taken. Whatever it is, when you have long-standing leadership, it converts into a dynasty. And when it does happen to that level, it becomes a problem.
I mean, China had Chairman Mao, for instance, right? Singapore had the Lee Kuan Yew. I'm not going to go to Russia because I don't particularly think that Stalin had a good record. You know, why is that difficult for Africa to cultivate that? Because we see our leaders develop this appetite to become feudal lords, so to say, after a long period of time. Like the Bongos, for instance. He served under his father's regime. He was Minister of Defense in 2009 before his father passed. And you get the sense that he's trying to replicate the same thing with his own son also, turning the whole situation into a fiefdom. Give me an understanding why we can't have shining examples like the Lee Kuan Yews, like, you know, like the Chairman Mao's or other people like that in Africa. For instance, with Paul Kagame, as you just said, he's not necessarily doing bad in Rwanda, but then people also want somebody else to just get in there.
There must be a name change, at least. Not a family business, because if it remains a family business, we continue to have problems. Now you see, like the Chinese, after all the revolutions, 1994, 74, 94, when China decided to close down totally from the world and say, look, we need 20 years of our life to reset our country. We have dropped communism, we've dropped this, we've dropped that. We want a new country based on understanding. And they were able to cultivate within themselves without any external help. Let's mark this, without any external help, because they refused. Now, it's a one-party state, but power and how it shifts is predictable. The 10-year tenure is respected. And within these 10 years, there is a mentoring that goes on. And so the next prime minister or president is known, is already been mentored. And so people will expect that by the end of 10 years, there's nothing like someone succeeding himself again. That's a clear example.
Except for Xi Jinping now. Anyway.
No, well, even him, that we have to wait. Right. Two, you could see how cost efficient the Chinese model, for instance, is of transition. Assuming China were to conduct an election based on the Nigerian standards, where we can spend up to 500 billion naira to conduct a general election in a country that is owing so much money, and we spend so much money to conduct an election that lasts only a week or so. China does not produce a ballot paper. They do not need the technologies. They've actually produced those gadgets for us to conduct our elections.
All right. So one area I would like us to explore in this conversation is a slight shift from the actual coup to the rare conversations that are happening on the background, which is one, the French tight-fisted hold on this African country, which can be which is now shaping this conversation in a manner to suggest that it's actually a coup for liberation of this country rather than just
there is a growing anti-French sentiment.
There's a growing conversation around how Western countries have backed authoritarian government under the guise of stability, and we are refusing to have that conversation because it's unpleasant in a way, or because it appears to we would rather have the conversation around military junta versus a democratic junta. How important is it that this country, in the real sense of the word, become independent from any kind of external control, as we have seen in the case of France and most of these countries?
Well, I don't know if we've been careful enough to notice the kind of wordings of reactions to these coups as they are coming out. The various foreign ministries in these countries are a bit cautious these days. Condemnation, yes, you could hear. Concern, expressions of concern, you could hear, right? Expressions of anger and the rest of them, of military rule does not solve any problem and the rest of. But there is a common thread, which is these concerns are being expressed with some reservations. To say, well, these countries should solve their problems themselves. Because people have seen, governments and countries across the world have seen that some of these coups have become like acceptable. Because what greets a coup announcement is jubilation rather than condemnation. Therefore, for a foreign government to sit down somewhere and say you are condemning the coup, but what alternative was there? None. When bad governance was ravaging the country, what did you do? Ordinarily, the collection of African leaders through the AU, the aegis of AU, should have been to say, okay, if there was governance issues in a particular country, the AU should be interested and be deeply involved. That's why I said the peer review mechanism was supposed to have triggered such a thing to say, wait, Mr. Man, we notice there is a disconnect within the country. So and so are not happening. I believe you need to go back, look at it and see what you can amend. None has happened.
But how practical is that? I mean, talking about NEPAD and that mechanism of peer review, how practical is it? Because constitutionally, they don't have the authority over any president, for instance. I mean, you can talk about it to him, you can make recommendations and suggestions. He only abides by the constitutional power he has in his country. And I suppose no African entity or bloc can come into that country and decide to implement some reforms unless the constitution of that country permits it to. And I don't think that we have that kind of arrangement yet.
Agreed. But you see, peer pressure from any angle makes a lot of sense. Because from childhood, let's assume, peer pressure had put people into some other things that they never accepted or think they can do. So, as leaders, if we African leaders were to be sincere enough, yes, peer pressure could have influenced some decisions, changes in some countries. You can't force it from outside, agreed, but it's advisory. And once your colleagues say, oh boy, wait, this thing can be done better this way. Yeah, out of 100, perhaps 10, 20 can make a difference. But for it to be such that nobody even comments about bad governance, for instance. Okay, you send either the AU, ECOWAS, SIAC, or SADC, or whatever, you send an election observation mission to a country. There's a bad election, obviously, right? And nothing happens. Why are you spending money to send a delegation? Why? That is the seed of trouble
Right. And let's expatiate on that, because from President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's spokesperson, he talks about abiding by electoral adjudication processes in those countries. And for a lot of people who say he who comes to equity must come with clean hands. I mean, Nigeria, we don't have a particularly good record of conducting free, fair, and credible elections in the first place. So who are we to preach, the idea of, rule of law and due process? Let's talk about the electoral process itself on the continent, and how, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Ghana, or any other country, whether it's even South Africa, for instance, those issues around, Zimbabwe just, is going through the same thing, where the ZANU-PF pretty much is, running the show, right? Even Kenya, over the past few years, the elections have been hugely, controversial for all the wrong reasons. What is it about, our elections that is fundamentally wrong? And what also can we say about the judicial system? Because whether it's a Francophone country or an Anglophone country, there are some common denominators around how the system itself is subservient to the powers that be in that particular country, so much so that you can't guarantee fair, or justice even whenever something is taken to court.
Well, at the bottom of it all is the failure of separation of powers. Because in a given setting, almost most countries, you find that the concept of the separation of powers has literally disappeared. So though the institutions of government are there physically, but they are inoperative. And so if you recall the Coup speech in Gabon, is to say all the institutions of government have been dissolved. Good. Because these are the same institutions that have failed to perform. Otherwise, if they do, we are not even going to have some of these lapses. Because if elections are challenged in court, the court should be able to say, yes, it is this or that. Unfortunately, in most cases, beside time dragging, the outcomes are usually not what people will also expect. So if money is spent to conduct an election, and at the end of the day, it is the wisdom, we put it in quotes, wisdom of maybe 7 judicial officers that will decide what and the real outcome of that election, and cannot be challenged thereafter, you begin to see the dictatorship of democracy itself. And that is what we are facing here in Africa. So this is some of the...
Dictatorship of democracy.
Yes.
Sounds like a paradox to me.
It is?
It's a democracy. How does it then have, dictatorial tendencies?
Okay. Dictatorship of democracy is when people cannot have, for instance, safety mechanisms built into it. And so whatever is decided by the institutions of government, faultily or otherwise, it remains contrary to the best wishes of people. So if people...
we've seen Supreme Court governors in Nigeria, for instance.
Good. If people cannot have their wishes actually expressed, don't forget, one of the triggers of the coup in Guinea was when Condé decided to extend his tenure. People came out to say no, it's against the constitution, it's against the rule of law, is whatsoever, right? And then the next thing is soldiers killing people. It has happened across.
I think Senegal too. Macky Sall had to come out and
Mali,
say he's not...
Niger, right? The soldiers were sent to go and kill innocent protesters. Now, if the civilians who elected someone into office don't even have a right to protest, we are not destroying anything, we are not saying, we just came to say, sorry sir, what is happening is not what we want. And then the next is the use of the military. And then the military comes and kill people and go home. Or the police are sent to go and kill people and come back home. And you believe that's democracy? No, that's dictatorship.
All right.
In civilian clothing.
Let us begin to, how would I call it, navigate into what we would possibly consider a solution. The last time you were here, in the case of Niger, you said some of the things you said, if I recall correctly, was that the option of bringing Bazoum back to power is not even on the table. Right? There have been several delegations from Nigeria, ECOWAS, even the AU, with all kinds of suggestions, but it does appear that everywhere is quiet, that we have run out of ideas. And basically, with every passing day, that government gains credence and acceptability, which further makes it worse. Algeria came up yesterday to talk about a 6-month period as against the 3 years that's been on the table, which clearly, if you like, you can tell from here that would not be accepted by the juntas. And whilst we are still exploring that this is on the table, and our president's comment is that he's speaking with the AU leaders to find what he described as a comprehensive approach to resolving this issue. What, in your view, would constitute a comprehensive approach? Because, like you said, there are fears that some country, by their nature and sharing similar, certain distinctive occurrence with where these coups have happened, may just be in line. What do we do to nip this in the bud, avert another coup, and begin to deliver on the benefits or dividends of democracy, if you like?
Well, I think for those countries that might be close to another election, which will mean tenure elongation, they should be advised outrightly to drop those desires.
And this should come from the AU?
Well, all AU, ECOWAS, SADC, and the rest of them. It has to be an active approach. If these leaders are sincere with themselves, that comes back to the peer review kind of a thing. This is the time for action, progressive, proactive action, rather than waiting to condemn a coup. Let us go out and tell these leaders, oh, wait, you have served 2 terms, you are planning to go for the 3rd.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Right? We will not support that.
I mean, is it inherently bad if someone has more to offer? For instance, if there is a constitutional provision, for instance, if the constitution of the country allows someone to go for a 3rd term?
No. No.
Why not?
When you say constitution of a country, constitution of a country, of course, they are all over the place, allowing the 3rd term. Yes, but were these constitutions truly a reflection of the wishes of the people? The answer is no. Capital no. Because we've seen where normally these dictators will manipulate the constitution to say, yes, 3rd term is not an offense, or even the number of years for a term could be extended, and what have you, and what have you. So at the end of the day, the president will tell you, in line with the reviewed constitution that allows a 3rd term. But that cannot be. So we cannot rely on those constitutions because they are equally faulty. And these are some of the issues. Assuming Africa were to stand on its feet to say, look, you can't amend some of these things. You should not, rather. Let's say you should not. Let it be that it has been advised, perhaps in some domains, publicly. Africa as a group, you have AU leaders, you have ECOWAS leaders coming out to say they don't support these constitutional changes.
Yeah, but within the African Union itself, you have countries that have 5-year tenures, single term, 7-year tenures in the case of Gabon, for instance, 4-year tenure in the case of Nigeria. How do you arrive at what is fair at this point?
No, what is fair can still be fair. Arriving at it might not really be as difficult as it is. We are not saying there should be a uniform rule, but as much as possible, the basis for these constitutions should have been such that it is not the beneficiary of a particular change that should enjoy those changes. When a sitting president says, okay, we need to amend the constitution to provide for 3rd term, and he's a direct beneficiary, you could see that, yes, it's flawed already. Those are the kind of things that the coalition of African leaders should be looking out for and say, no, 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 That cannot be. Assuming a constitutional change was made to say, okay, from so period, we shall have a 10-year review of 4 to 5 or 6 years, but the incumbent is not a beneficiary. That makes a difference. But when the incumbent is a beneficiary, automatically is a red flag, and should be made very clear to whosoever, so that we can minimize, the word is minimize, some of these instances of in quotes, unconstitutional changes of government. Because if changes are not constitutional changes are not possible, then we must be able to tolerate unconstitutional changes.
Yeah. I mean, pardon the interruption. For a lot of people, right, it's a catch-22 situation where you are forced to condemn the poor performance of the government, but you also don't necessarily want to overly celebrate or overtly celebrate military rule, because you do know that it is not a permanent solution, right? So how do we strike a balance here, especially when you look at the common denominator between all of these countries that are involved right now, former French colonies? And we also understand, to Sunday's point earlier, about France's stronghold on the economics of all of these countries, where, you know, you're dealing with neo-colonial characteristics, right? France prints their money. France virtually controls the economy. They have the right of first refusal when it comes to exploration and all of these things. And it doesn't look like a fair deal, because all of these countries with their immense potential are largely poor, you know, by their profile, even though they do have the potential of actually overcoming all of these structural challenges. Give me a sense of whether this wave is also going to be continuously fueled by this anti-French sentiment, because regardless of how poor their governments perform, people don't also want to feel beholden to France, because they believe that the exploitation has been going on for decades, and rightfully so. So how do you square this conversation between trying to make structural adjustments and also breaking away from France and its stranglehold on their economy?
Well, I think what basically is happening is, yes, enough is enough of France in Africa. And indeed, this will spill to other island nations that are totally insignificant in world configurations. Plenty of islands that are still French territories, right? Now, the independent African countries have definitely come to the realization that France has exploited enough. Don't forget, France has stockpiled, for instance, like the uranium from Niger, such that they may not even need any more mining for the next 50 years, based on statistics available. So already, those exploitations have become too enormous. And that's why, even in Gabon, the two giants there, Total Energy and Eramet in the manganese mines, you can see how muted their responses have been to this coup, because for them, it is not the welfare of Gabonese, it is their commercial interest. Okay, so coup has occurred. The government has been toppled. A new government is coming in. The foreign ministry is not willing to condemn the coup to a point where they could anger the new government.
Is it because also the soldiers did not express their anti-French sentiment like we saw in Niger, for instance? Because they were just largely talking about the elections and the corruption within the government. They didn't say anything about France at the moment.
Well, I think for strategic reasons, they were right. Because it is only a foolish person that begins to talk about the crocodile before crossing the river. Right, so they were cautious enough to say, okay, let's consolidate. We need to wait for the next few moments to see what the actual reaction of these military guys are going to be. And don't forget, these are young people, young generals, and social media has made it also possible now that they will also have equal access to sentiments, to data, reactions, and what have you, like any other person. Unlike in the past, when leaders will only hear what their handlers want them to hear, Today,
they can go on Twitter and or X and see everything.
We are almost on the same level. Technology has brought transparency beyond what we can believe. And therefore, the leaders are also hearing, they are seeing, they are feeling. Therefore, French sentiments, anti-French sentiments, are certainly growing, and there's no going back. France has to go, and mine is business in France, because here in Africa, definitely, I can assure you, we will need to converge here again very soon, because there are more countries that must come through. There's no choice, because citizens are watching what's happening.
Do you have any particular countries in mind?
Well,
not that we're trying to give them a heads up, but we're trying to get into your thought process.
I think our neighbor cannot be taken off the radar just easily. Cameroon, certainly care must be taken.
You don't think they're too internally divided to take up this initiative?
You know, one of the interesting facts is, like we said earlier, a moment ago, the coups have become fashionable in the sense that there are hardly any counters. Because, watch the trend, it is from within. The man who has been entrusted with guarding Mr. President,
who takes over. That's a palace coup.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a difference from when you have a contingent of the same army challenging each other to protect Mr. President, because a coup was hatched and implemented from outside, and the presidential guard says, no, you can't access here. Today, it is the reverse in almost all these instances that we are having today. And so the internal divisions in Cameroon, for instance, yes, it has been playing an important role in what has happening in that country. This one is against this, the Anglophone, the Francophone. But today, the level of poverty, discontent, and the rest of them is knowing no dichotomy anymore.
All right. One other areas that keen watchers will be interested in is how much has the situation in Gabon complicated the situation in Niger. We are now seeing measured response, far more measured response from our own president and indeed every other president than the way they sounded in the case of Niger. It made the Niger case felt like one local government in Nigeria where you can just order something from Abuja and there will be rumbles and tumblings and all of that. And these guys have held their grounds against that and even increased their acceptability and sentiments around their people around responding to those messaging. How much has it complicated the whole plans? Because we read in some quarters how some countries have rejected the Americans' overture to use their airfield. I think Algeria has done that as a foreground for their intervention in Niger. They've not been able to do anything with the fields that they have in conjunction with the French Reich inside Niger. Because if you have to do that in Niger, then you must be thinking of what to do with Ivory Coast, what to do with Mali, now Gabon, and all other places. What do you think would be are we going to see a 360, if you like, on how the issue of Niger progresses from this point? Because to further complicate these things is the role that Russia is playing, now providing machineries to these places to say, we support what you are doing, we are here with you to respond to any.
And I think also surprisingly, I think Russia also commented on the Gabon situation also.
Yeah. Well, you see, Gabon has complicated Niger perfectly, in the sense that success begets success. Now, here we said the other time, ECOWAS' response was faulty. You suspend, and I remember you picked me up to say, but can they also remain in the fold? Okay. Don't threaten when you cannot take it through. Never. And that's what's happened. You cannot restore Bazoum just like that to power easily without bloodshed. And bloodshed is not anything one will want. Now, the dynamics have changed. We are in a unipolar world today, whether we like it or not. It used to be America, and it now is a poly world in where you have medium powers, superpowers, and etc., complicating the arithmetic for whatever. And economic interest has become preponderant in all this. And so Africa, like people have clearly described as the last frontier, it is here that the mineral resources are. And so for industrial production, yes, countries depend here. Now, if that is the case, everybody is still scrambling. The scramble for Africa of the 1800s is in a new wave today. And so Niger becomes very difficult for West Africa to handle because these guys have consolidated. Removing them today will amount to almost an impossibility.
Okay, we really have to go, but just a quick thought on, you know, what is happening, especially within West Africa and across the continent. Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan. You have this alignment across, you know, the equator of military governments, and we saw that alliance between Burkina Faso and Mali offering aid and arrangement with Niger. Should there be an ECOWAS military intervention, we're going to come to your aid. And now you have another one in Gabon. The strength in numbers is growing. It appears that this is going to be a new normal where we have to negotiate with all these military juntas and say, okay, let's come to an agreement of how to have like an operational arrangement. Do you think that that is likely going to be the case? The more they spring up, the more the world has to accept that this is now a reality that we have to deal with.
We don't have to wait. The world has accepted as of today. What else would you really do? These guys are in an alliance. And the danger is, like I said the other time, and one has to repeat, if care is not taken, for ECOWAS in particular, the implication would be that you will have a parallel organization. If care is not taken, you will end up with a parallel organization because very soon, 1-2 more countries and then ECOWAS has no forum, a quorum. Because if you suspend A, B, C, D up to a point, you cannot form a quorum. That affects the organization itself fundamentally. Very good. So the treaty becomes suspended too. And therefore, you run the risk of not having an ECOWAS.
Interesting.
Do we have to wait until we get there? No, the solution should have been to go back and sit down with these people carefully and negotiate properly. Now, we've said so, and we repeat, negotiating with someone who just took over power is very, very complicated.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's leave it there because we can't negotiate for more time because they're screaming in our ears, you know, to wrap things up at this moment. Perhaps until next time, until the next one, or until there's a new development, Ambassador, we're going to have to leave it here for now. As always, we really appreciate your invaluable contribution to the analysis. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.